Darkness.
Elko, Hitra Buglo Hans. Seize that on Rajiadorn. Thagon well rogue. Tosan no Paiki. Mayhap I might if I deign to speak in my guest crude tongue. We meet at last. I am Lahabrea of the Ascians, servant to the one true God. Yours is a most fantastical tale, truly absorbing. It is a tale to tell Eorzea's children before bedtime, and it will soon be dark, bringer of light.
The dark minions.
All that stands between this world and darkness is an irksome anomaly in the ether. The Echo. Yes, yours is a most fascinating tale. Alas, like all good tales, it must needs come to an end. But fear not.
Here, feel the presence of evil.
For the end of your tale is but the beginning of another. The tale of the crystal's demise.
Alphino wordlessly passed me as I entered the Waking Sands. He had not previously mentioned his association with the Scions, but it certainly did not surprise me. Phrixio, the elder sylph of Little Solace, had sent an emissary of his, Noraxia, to Thanalin in order to assist the Scions, and we were all relieved by this gesture of solidarity from the Cabbages. Tataru was quite frightened of the sylph. Perhaps it was some sort of existential crisis for one kind of talking vegetable to meet another. After our debrief, Minfilia recommended a respite, but she could sense clearly enough that something from Todorak had left me disquieted. I told her of Lahabrea, his threats and confessions, and it disturbed the antecedent that the Ascians had so dropped the veil they had long held before their presence and motives. Minfilia and I were of one mind that this creature begged pursuing, while the Scions' other projects were running relatively smoothly. Minfilia could tell me precious little of the Ascians, but her suspicion that they were perhaps the ultimate force behind the realm's many ailments. This seemed to align with the sharp warnings that had reached me from Hydaelyn when I had encountered this Lahabrea. The Scions had already begun to employ their network to discern any and everything possible about these robed figures. The Flames had responded regarding a potential sighting, and in light of my own report, Minfilia bid me immediately launch an investigation with the assistance of my commanders at the Hall of Flames. Commander Swift had received a report from a Highbridge brass blade, who may well have sighted an Ascian, but it seems that the witness was already dead and cold. All the same, it was a lead of sorts, and one that I decided was worth making the trip east. The local merchants offered me some rumors, but it seemed that they had their hands quite full with a recent spat of Kikurn raids. Uncharacteristically well orchestrated raids that had only been occurring since the beastmen had been noticed meeting with a shadowy figure. This was cause enough to infiltrate the Kikurn lair about as quietly and subtly as an 8-form Rogadan can manage, which is to say I more or less cleared the place out. I found a letter amongst the scrap which one of the merchants translated for me from Amalj'aa. It pertained to an agreement with the Kikurn to traffic kidnapped peoples from Highbridge to the Sandgate's Amalj'aa, presumably to offer to Ifrit. Although this was no direct help to my investigation, the same merchant believed that he had spotted my quarry standing over a fire by Thal's Respite. meeting with some local Kikern. Ihibaru suggested that I might use the same kind of smoke signal to lure the same rats out, and I did as he suggested. I was not answered by the Kikern, however, but by a pugilist in the garb of a bandit gang of former Ala Mhigan refugees, the Corpse Brigade. He held a papal ward of the Ala Mhigan patron Ralga, and this was lead enough to drive me south to Little Ala Mhigo, that I might make some connection between the Corpse Brigade and the Ascian, wearing a ridiculous tin can gift from the grateful potatoes of Highbridge. The Ala Mhigans were as xenophobic as their reputation, but I suppose they had the right of it. They were few who had escaped the Garlean occupation of their homes, outcast for decades and treated with little warmth by their new hosts in Thanalan and the Twelves would alike. The old Highlander Gundobald would hardly acknowledge me upon my arrival. The only useful knowledge to be gained was from my fellow Flames officers stationed around the region, one of which believed he may indeed have seen a masked man meeting with a handful of the refugees. The commander Giselbert suggested that if I wanted the Ala Mhigans' cooperation, I must first find some way to ingratiate myself with the resistance. After a few days performing leaves for the thinly stretched flames in southern Thanalan, I reported my progress to the antecedent, and she told me that there was in fact an Ala Mhigan native among the Scions. Aside from Minfilia herself, I should mention, but I've heard that was a lifetime ago, a story of a lost young girl with a different name. My counterpart Haribert admitted that he had indeed been a member of the Resistance before he found the Scions and had since lost contact with all of his former comrades. There was but one in Quarrymill, from which he believed his name might extract some favour, Albreda, seemingly a former lover, but the refugees of Quarrymill had problems of their own. Their very presence in the shroud was a danger to themselves. They had never been accepted by the elementals and excused from the Greenwrath. I acquainted myself with their resistance captain, and after I'd procured a remedy for his injured brother with the help of Boscaron and rescued the fool after he wandered out into the woods to die, the captain wrote me a letter of recommendation to present to Gundobald in order to progress with my investigation at Little Ala Mhigo. The old bear found this sufficient evidence for my good intentions, and he finally conceded that some of the youths from the settlement had in fact been corroborating in secret with a masked stranger. He granted me leave to ask around. The lads and lasses were as tight-lipped as you would expect, but I managed to confirm the same rumours. Gundobald was deeply concerned by these meetings and the anger that burned within the young ones that would drive them to folly and haste. I was determined to identify and follow whoever the lads looked to as their leader in this scheme, but the brazen Vylbrand did the work for me, summoning me to a meeting by a craggy rift in which I could be so conveniently blindsided. The fool thought to have me quite unprepared and pushed a pair of his witless cousins under my axe. I swatted them with the blunt side and Vylbrand panicked and fled. Gundobald and I swept the settlement for anything that might illuminate the plot. A map of Zan'rak, a blunt hunting knife, and a mention of crystals. They meant to raid the Amalj'aa crystal cache for a purpose unthinkable, to somehow summon Ralga as a primal, and we hastened to intercept them. Vylbrand had made its scarce 20 fulms onto the bridge towards Zan'rak and was already thoroughly routed, retreating before the bodies of his slain brothers and sisters trampled under massive, scaled feet. Gundobald and I threw ourselves into the tide of Amalj'aa, battle drakes, and tempered slaves. Vylbrand was fortunate to have escaped with his life, and Gundobald drew his gaze to the tempered thralls, showing him the fate of those that called on manifestations of their gods. Back at the settlement, Vylbrand confessed that a masked man had appeared before the youths, told them how to summon Ralga using the crystals, and set them upon this foolish path. The crisis in Little Ala Mhigo seemed to be thus resolved, and I'd realized that the Ascians must be the self-same paragons to which Ifrit had referred, but I was no closer to apprehending my mark. I made my report to the antecedent and spent some more time in training and Flame's duties while she devised our next move. Eventually, Minfilia acquired another lead regarding an Ascian sighting around the Folgord float north of Gridania, and our sylph friend Noraxia confirmed that it was an Ash-crowned consortium digging one that encountered the sinister one. I found the minor Medrod, but the fright had left him all but catatonic. After a hot meal and some soothing words, the man-child told me of the Ascian and more, of a floating monstrosity all eyeball and teeth, and of the mutilated corpse of a poor young woman not far west from the float. He thought the masked man to be a soul collector from the realm of Thal, and fled without a second thought. Once I told them of my investigation, Medrod's team agreed to assist me as well as they could, and I soon recovered one of the bodies of the seemingly numerous victim girls, warded by the toothy eyeball, that I've since identified as from a ferocious class of voidsent, the Ahriman. The girl's face was torn well beyond anyone's ability to identify, but upon the corpse we found an auspicious button, engraved with a lily motif. Sergeant Ethelmere suggested that Mion might be able to identify the sigil, so I left the Serpent officers to the grisly task of recovering further bodies, and returned to the Carline Canopy. Mother Mion couldn't place the origins of the White Lily, but after a short time asking around, I came across someone who could. Someone who in fact had the very same button upon the breast of his coat. This old Elazan Ursandel wordlessly imparted to me a whole new understanding for the depths of melancholy. He immediately identified the crest of the ancient house of Dartencourt, and the story soon unfolded. The once kind and radiant Lady Amandine Dartencourt had suffered disfiguring injuries on the night of the calamity that she could not reconcile with her vanity and pride. She isolated herself in her chamber for years before she began taking the counsel of foreign masked men, who spoke of tantalizing rites of rejuvenation. She pursued their advice, which escalated into rituals more and more abhorrent, eventually mutilating and murdering a handmaiden, whose corpse the luckless and ever-faithful manservant Ursandel was tasked with disposing, after which he never again returned to the house and vowed to discard his old life completely. Now learning that her appetite for these poor maidens had steadily grown, Ursandel implored me to breach the Haukke Manor in which she resided and put his wicked matron to rest. Scores of voidsent lurked around the grounds of that place, but the atrium was dark and quiet, but for the distant echoes of screams and laughter. The hallways were full of smashed furniture, stone gargoyles, vilekin, fungus, bats, and stalking succubi. There were signs of struggles throughout the house and the unmistakable scent of blood, but not a single corpse in sight. My party and I found long-bleached ashkin in the basement, which itself led down to some kind of dungeon, painted with fetid gore. I realized what had become of the bodies. It seemed that each of the ladies' maids had blossomed into succubi through foul and necromantic rituals. Clearing the deepest holes full of cages, torture racks, and drains clogged with blood, we eventually broke the ward that had blocked the chambers of Amandine. They were clouded with a familiar noxious dark, and the lady had already suffered a similar fate to her victims. We mitigated her magics and sent her finally screaming to the pit. My allies could not quit that place soon enough, but a cold breath on my nape stayed me. A pair of Ascians spoke to me of their master Lahabrea, of these crystals which drew the light onto me, and of their feeling that my existence was mutually exclusive with theirs. Of that, I could not agree more. They claimed that they had been tasked to test the progression of my strength, but I think they were simply loath to concede that I had thwarted their Voidsent puppets. They left into the air, with a taunt to the moniker they had for me, Bringer of Light. This was the end of the trail that Lahabrea had left for me, and I suppose that this small victory will have to satisfy the Scions for now. The antecedent drew little comfort from the conclusion of Lady Amandine. I sense that she feels quite out of her depth with these Ascians. Their schemes do not seem half as straightforward and transparent as those of the Primals. And if my experience of the past few weeks is any indication, they are deeply embedded across the realm. We will petition the city-states to escalate their vigil against the darkness, but Minfilia and I have been forced to set our investigation aside. The kobolds chatter beneath Vylbrand, and Ogomero rumbles. The Maelstrom command has reached a clear conclusion. The Titan has emerged, and it begs some specialist attention. I will depart soon to seek the company of heroes for a tactical advantage, and then onward to break a mountain.